Socrates was dead. Athens had condemned the man who walked through its streets asking what justice was. The city had put him on trial. It had found him guilty. And then it had handed him a cup of hemlock. But among those who witnessed the consequences of that sentence was a young man who would never look at politics, truth, or reality in the same way again. His name was Plato. He had seen a democracy make a profoundly unjust decision. He had seen persuasive speeches defeat sound arguments. He had seen people completely convinced that they understood things they had never examined. And he began to suspect that the problem went much deeper. Because if a crowd can mistake a lie for the truth, if our senses can deceive us, if everything we see changes, grows old, and disappears, where could we possibly find something truly stable? Think about it. A person may appear just without actually being just. A law may be considered fair today and absurd tomorrow. A government may present itself as the defender of the city while condemning the very man who is trying to make that city think. So, is justice merely whatever a society decides to call justice? Does truth depend on who speaks most convincingly? Or is there something beyond our opinions? Plato devoted much of his life to searching for an answer, and he reached a conclusion that was as powerful as it was strange. Perhaps the world we see is not the whole of reality. Perhaps the things we touch, buy, desire, and lose are only imperfect manifestations of something that never changes. A truth that does not grow old. A beauty that does not fade. A justice that does not depend on a vote. Plato was about to build one of the most influential philosophical systems in history. But there is one small complication. He did not write treatises directly explaining everything he believed. He wrote dialogues. Conversations in which Socrates nearly always appeared, asking questions, testing answers, and leaving someone intellectually wounded along the way. That is why reading Plato presents us with a difficult problem. Are we hearing the real Socrates? Are we hearing Plato using Socrates as a character? Or are we witnessing a conversation between the two of them, even though one was already dead? There is no simple answer. But there is something we do know. Plato took the question that had destroyed Socrates' peace and turned it into an enormous philosophical project. What is truly real? To answer that question, he would have to take philosophy beyond the visible world, beyond the things that change, beyond opinions, beyond the shadows. And so began the search for the world behind the world. For Plato, the great problem with this world was quite simple. Everything changes. People change. Cities change. Laws change. Even something that seems absolutely certain today may look ridiculous a few years from now. You only need to find an old photograph of yourself to prove it. At some point, you looked at that hairstyle, those clothes, and that expression, and thought, yes, this perfectly represents who I am. Fortunately, time had other plans. But Plato was not concerned with our unfortunate fashion choices. He was trying to solve a much deeper problem. If everything changes, how can we know anything with certainty? Imagine someone asks you to draw a perfect circle. You can try. You can use a compass. You can measure it carefully. You can hold your breath as though you were defusing a bomb. But if we examine your drawing closely enough, we will find some imperfection. The line will deviate slightly. The paper will not be perfectly uniform. The ink will occupy the surface unevenly. The perfect circle is nowhere in front of us. And yet we know exactly what a perfect circle is. We can think about it. We can describe its properties. We can compare every circle we see with a model that we never fully encounter in the physical world. So where does that model come from? Plato answered with his theory of forms. For him, the things we perceive through our senses are changing, particular, and imperfect. But behind them are universal, eternal, and unchanging realities. The forms, or ideas, depending on the translation. Not ideas in the sense of, I have a brilliant idea for an app no one asked for. The forms were not simply thoughts invented by our minds. They were what made each thing what it was. There are many beautiful things. A face, a sculpture, a melody, a sky glowing completely red at sunset. They are all different, and all of them can lose their beauty. The face grows old. The sculpture breaks. The melody is forgotten. The sky disappears within minutes, but what we call beauty does not grow old along with them. For Plato, beautiful things are beautiful because, in some way, they participate in the form of beauty. The same would apply to justice, equality, goodness, and many other realities. We can encounter actions that are more or less just, laws that are more or less just, people who constantly talk about justice and, curiously, never practice it. But none of these would be perfect justice. They would be approximations, incomplete copies, manifestations of something higher. This does not necessarily mean that Plato imagined a secret district of the universe where a perfect chair, a perfect horse, and the ultimate duck were waiting for us to arrive. The theory is more sophisticated than a cosmic warehouse filled with original objects. The central idea is that reality has different levels. What we see is subject to time, change, and destruction. What we understand through reason can be universal and unchanging. Your eyes show you many imperfect triangles. Reason understands what makes every one of them a triangle. Your eyes show you contradictory human decisions. Reason tries to discover what justice itself is. That is why Plato distrusted the senses so deeply. The senses show us appearances. Reason tries to reach what remains behind them. And here we can see that the ancient argument between Heraclitus and Parmenides was not over yet. Heraclitus had said that everything changes. Parmenides had argued that true reality could not change. Plato found a way to keep both of them inside the same philosophy. The visible world changes, as Heraclitus had observed. But the forms remain, as Parmenides demanded. Problem solved. Or, at least, moved somewhere far more difficult to explain. Because now another question emerged. If we live surrounded by imperfect things, how can we leave appearances behind and reach the truth? To explain this, Plato imagined a cave. Inside it was a group of prisoners. And the most disturbing part was that none of them knew they were prisoners. Imagine a group of people who have been chained inside a cave since birth. They cannot turn their heads. They can only look at a wall. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, other people carry different objects. The light casts the shadows of those objects onto the wall. For the prisoners, those shadows are the whole of reality. They have never known anything else. Then, one day, one of them manages to break free. When he turns his head, the light causes him pain. He discovers the fire. He discovers the objects. And he realizes that everything he had considered real was merely a projection. Then he leaves the cave. At first, the sunlight almost blinds him. Over time, his eyes adjust, and at last he sees the world outside. But the story does not end with him peacefully enjoying the truth. The former prisoner decides to return. He wants to free the others. But after seeing the light, he can no longer move properly in the darkness. He stumbles. He appears disoriented. The prisoners conclude that leaving the cave has ruined his sight. And when he tries to free them, they react with hostility. Because discovering that you have been wrong your entire life does not usually produce immediate gratitude. Sometimes it produces anger. The allegory represents the pain of leaving ignorance behind. The shadows are the appearances and opinions that we mistake for reality. The journey out is the slow process of philosophical education, and the return reveals the responsibility of anyone who discovers something true, to go back and help others, even when no one has asked for help. Plato was also talking about Socrates, a man who tried to make his city look beyond the shadows and was condemned by those who preferred to keep watching them. After watching Athens condemn Socrates, Plato was not exactly delighted with democracy. If a majority could be carried away by speeches, interests, and emotions, then voting could not guarantee a just decision. A crowd could also be wrong, and it could be wrong with remarkably democratic confidence. In the Republic, Plato tried to imagine what a city governed according to justice would look like. To explain it, he compared the city to the human soul. According to him, the soul has three parts. The rational part seeks understanding and makes considered decisions. The spirited part is connected to courage, pride, and indignation. And the appetitive part desires food, pleasure, money, and all those things that suddenly feel absolutely essential during a sale. A just person would be someone whose three parts remained in balance under the guidance of reason. The city would work in a similar way. The producers would provide for its material needs. The guardians would defend the community. And the philosophers would rule. Yes, rather conveniently, the philosopher concluded that people like him should run the state. But Plato's philosopher-king was not simply someone who had read a great many books and now corrected everyone at dinner. He would be someone educated for decades to master his own desires, understand the good, and govern without using power for personal gain. Plato knew that power attracted precisely those who desired it most. That is why he defended a paradoxical idea. The best rulers would be those who were not desperate to rule. His political project may seem rigid, elitist, and even dangerous to us, and many of his proposals genuinely are. But the question that motivated him remains alive. Should a country be governed by whoever receives the most votes, or by those who possess the knowledge and character required to make good decisions? Plato built a philosophy oriented towards perfection. But his most brilliant student would begin to suspect that truth was not located in another world. It was here, in plants, animals, cities, and the things we can observe. His name was Aristotle. Aristotle arrived in Athens at about the age of 17 and remained at Plato's academy for nearly 20 years. He was Plato's student. He studied his ideas. He admired his teacher. And then he did what every great student eventually does. He began to disagree. Plato searched for truth beyond the visible world. Aristotle looked around and thought, perhaps we should investigate this world before we go looking for another one. For him, there was no need to separate things from their forms. The essence of a horse would not exist in some perfect realm far away from every real horse. It would be present in the horses themselves, in their structure, their capacities, and their way of existing. Form did not exist separately from matter. Together, they constituted each concrete being. This difference changed the method. Plato began with universal principles in order to understand particular things. Aristotle observed particular things, compared their characteristics, and searched for the principles they shared. And he observed practically everything. animals, plants, governments, poems, arguments, the movement of the stars. He was probably the kind of person who received a simple question over dinner and answered it by creating an entirely new field of knowledge. He studied hundreds of species and produced some of the earliest systematic classifications of living things. He also organized the principles of logic that would influence Western thought for nearly 2,000 years. Of course, he made mistakes. Many of them. Aristotle did not have microscopes, telescopes, or access to several centuries of scientific research. But his greatness did not lie in always being right. It lay in his attempt to observe, compare, classify, and explain every aspect of reality. For him, knowing something did not simply mean giving it a name. It meant understanding why that thing existed and why it changed. And to answer those questions, Aristotle decided that one cause was not enough. We needed four. Imagine a statue. If we ask why it exists, you would probably answer, because someone made it. Aristotle would say that the answer is incomplete. To truly understand something, we need to know four kinds of cause. First, the material cause. What is it made of? In the case of the statue, it might be marble. Then comes the formal cause. What form or structure does it have? The marble has been organized to represent a particular figure. The third is the efficient cause. Who or what produced the transformation? The sculptor. And finally, there is the final cause. What was it made for? Perhaps to decorate a temple, commemorate a person, or prove that someone had far too much marble and spare time. Matter. Form. Origin. Purpose. For Aristotle, knowing something meant understanding these different dimensions. Nature was not a collection of isolated objects. It was a system of beings that changed and developed their own capacities. A seed can become a tree because it possesses that potential. The tree is the realization of what already existed as a possibility within the seed. Aristotle described this process as the movement from potentiality to actuality. He also organized logic in order to distinguish valid reasoning from arguments that merely sound intelligent. For example, all human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. But if the premises are wrong, you can construct a perfectly logical argument and end up defending something ridiculous with an impeccable structure. Logic organizes reasoning. It does not replace contact with reality. But the question of purpose led Aristotle towards an even more immediate problem. If every activity aims at some good, what is the good that we seek throughout our entire lives? His answer was eudaimonia. The word eudaimonia is often translated as happiness. But that translation can be misleading. Aristotle was not talking about feeling cheerful all the time. No one can maintain a permanent smile without looking slightly disturbed. Eudaimonia is closer to living well, fulfilling our capacities, and building a flourishing human life. It is not a passing emotion. It is the result of an entire way of living. For Aristotle, everything has a function. A good knife cuts well. A good musician masters their instrument. And what distinguishes human beings is our capacity to act rationally. Therefore, a good life requires us to use reason well and develop a virtuous character. But no one becomes virtuous simply by reading about virtue. We become just by performing just actions. We become courageous by practicing courage. We become disciplined by doing what needs to be done, especially when we do not feel motivated. Character is built through repetition. Your decisions become habits, and your habits, little by little, become you. Aristotle also argued that many virtues lie between two extremes. Courage, for example, lies between cowardice and recklessness. A courageous person does not run away from every risk, but they do not face an entire army alone just to prove they have a personality either. This golden mean is not a mathematical formula. It does not mean always doing exactly half of everything. It depends on the situation, the person, and practical wisdom, what Aristotle called phronesis. Knowing what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and why. Ethics, then, was not simply meant to help us discuss what goodness was. It was meant to help us become people capable of practicing it. Plato had searched for the good life by looking towards an eternal truth. Aristotle searched for it by observing how our actions shape our character. But while teacher and student were building their systems, the Greek world was about to change completely. And Aristotle would eventually educate the man responsible for that transformation. Years after leaving the academy, Aristotle received a rather unusual assignment: to educate the young Alexander of Macedon. The boy would enter history as Alexander the Great. We do not know exactly how much Aristotle's lessons influenced his decisions, but considering that Alexander conquered territory stretching from Greece to regions near India, we can safely assume that the geography lessons were an absolute success. After returning to Athens, Aristotle founded his own school, the Lyceum. There he taught, conducted research, and gathered information about practically everything that could be studied. While Plato had created dialogues that led towards universal realities, Aristotle built systems to organize the concrete world. That difference left Western philosophy with two great paths. One asked, what perfect reality exists behind things? The other asked, what can we discover by observing the things themselves? But the world around these philosophers was already changing. Alexander's conquests broke down old borders and connected very different cultures, languages, and traditions. When he died in 323 BCE, he was only 32 years old and left behind a vast empire with no stable succession. Aristotle died the following year. The age of the great independent Greek city-states was coming to an end, and the questions of philosophy changed with it. In a world that was larger, less stable, and harder to control, people began searching for something different. It was no longer enough to ask what the ideal city should look like. Now they needed to know how to preserve their peace of mind when the world outside seemed to be falling apart. Some would abandon wealth and live like dogs. Others would seek serenity by accepting what they could not control. Still others would defend simple pleasure, friendship, and a life away from political noise. Philosophy was about to become an art for surviving chaos. But that story begins in the next chapter. Plato and Aristotle began with the same wound, the death of Socrates. But they followed different paths. Plato looked at a world that was changing, imperfect and contradictory, and searched for an eternal reality behind appearances. The forms. Truth reached through reason. The journey out of the cave. Aristotle preferred to keep his feet on the ground. He observed animals, plants, governments, arguments, and human actions. He tried to understand not only what things were, but also how they changed, why they existed, and where they were going. Plato taught us to distrust what appears obvious. Aristotle taught us to observe it more carefully. One compels us to look beyond the world. The other compels us to look more closely at the world in front of us. And we still live between those two impulses. We search for universal principles, but we have to apply them in particular situations. We want to know what perfect justice is, but we must make decisions within imperfect societies. We want to understand what a good life is, while trying to build one out of habits, mistakes, and days when simply getting out of bed already feels like a small philosophical victory. Plato and Aristotle did not answer every question, but they mapped the ground across which much of Western philosophy would continue to travel. After them, the Greek world expanded. Empires grew. Old certainties began to collapse. And philosophy had to respond to an urgent concern. How can we live in peace when almost nothing around us is under our control? If you want to continue this journey through the history of ideas, subscribe to Human State. And share this video with that person who is still trying to leave the cave, or with the one who already escaped, saw the light, and came back only to argue in the comments. I will see you in History of Philosophy, Chapter 3. Philosophies for Surviving Chaos.